Tov. Today's daf yomi is Bava Basra daf tzadi ches, Bava Basra 98, but we're going to start on the bottom of tzadi sayin Amud Beis 97b, 3 lines from the bottom. Today's daf is dedicated for Shemir for the Chayalim, Hatzalah for the Shvuyim, and Yeshua for Am Yisrael on this Eis Tzara. Says the Mishnah, Mocher Yayin L'Chavero V'Hichmitz, somebody who sells wine to his friend, and the wine became vinegar. Then so the seller is not responsible. Rashbam explains because when he sold it, it was wine. And if it's known that this person's wine turned into vinegar, meaning to say, Rashbam says that every year we know that this guy's wine turns to vinegar, then it's a mistaken sale. And the Gemara is going to establish that this case is talking about where the person purchased the wine for cooking, which is supposed to be a wine that lasts longer. So therefore, then, under those circumstances, he's not responsible. But if it's known that the wine turns into vinegar, then it's a mistaken sale, and the purchaser is entitled to his money back. And if he says, I'm selling you wine that will last, then presumably they're making the wine at Sukkot time, and that wine has to last all the way to Shavuos. And if he says, I'm selling you wine that is old, Mishal Ishtakad, then it has to last from last year until now. Or if he says Miyushan, if he says it's the old wine, Mishal Gimel Shanim, it means from 3 years ago. And the Gemara is going to explain up until what point. So first comes along Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi limits the application of our Gemara to a specific case. He says Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina Ushanu Ela B'Kankanim Delukeach. When do we say this idea that if the seller sells the wine, the seller is not responsible if the wine turns into vinegar? That's only if it was in the jars of the purchaser, because it's the purchaser's jars. But if it was in the seller's jars, then we're going to say, or 98a at the top, if we're talking about a case where the person sold somebody wine and it's become vinegar. So our Mishnah says the seller is not responsible. Comes along Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, he says, when is the seller not responsible? If it was the jars of the purchaser. But if it's the jars of the seller, then the purchaser can basically give it back to him and say, here's your wine and here's your jugs. I don't want it anymore. And the Gemara, that's how Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina understands the case of our Mishnah. The Gemara says, who cares if it's the jugs of the seller? He should have said to him, even if it's the jugs of the seller can have a claim. He could say, you kept it too long. That's why it went vinegar. Who told you to keep it this long? The said, no, it's so it's two scenarios. It's not only the jugs of the Amar Leila Mikvah. It's not only the jugs of the seller where he's not responsible. If it would be the jugs of the purchaser, then the seller is responsible. So the jugs of the seller, then he's going to be responsible only in a case where the purchaser said, I'm buying this wine lamikpa, which means for cooking, and the cooking wine was supposed to last longer. So therefore, since he has these two factors, it's the wine it's in the jars of the seller, and also the purchaser says it's for cooking. Therefore, the purchaser can return to the seller. So the Gemara says, why does Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina have to say that our scenario is it's the jars of the purchaser and he bought it to last, and that's where the seller is not responsible? But why can't we just say, why don't we just say it's the jars of the seller with a low, and he didn't say he wanted to last, and so since he didn't say he wanted it to last, then even though it's the jars of the seller, then once he sells it to him, since he didn't say he wants it to last, the seller's not responsible anymore. And just don't say it's talking about a case where he bought it for cooking. So Amar Rav Amasnisin Kashisa. Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina doesn't want to take that approach because the Mishnah is difficult. Because it says in the next clause, if it's known that the wine goes bad, it's a mistaken sale. Why would it be a mistaken sale? You shouldn't have kept it that long. No, so it's obviously talking about a case where he said, I'm buying it for cooking. Therefore, he's supposed to keep it long. And so therefore, we have to say that the Mishnah is talking about a case where it's the jars of the purchaser. That's where the seller is not responsible. If it would be the jars of the seller would be responsible. Shema Mina. Who pleaded Rav Chiya Bar Yosef. Rav Chiya Bar Yosef argues with Rav Yosef Bar Chanina. Then Rav Chiya Bar Yosef Chamra Mazala Demari Garim. And even if it's the jars of the seller and the purchaser buys it, the seller is allowed to say, no, your bad luck caused the wine to go bad. As it says, even though the wine, that we say that even though the wine is going bad, Gever Yahir, meaning to say that even though the wine goes bad, it's because of the person who's arrogant that caused the wine to go bad. Why did the wine go bad? Because its owner was a Gever Yahir. He was an arrogant man. And so therefore, just like he was arrogant about something that he really had no reason to be arrogant about, he should have been humble. Therefore, God punished him that he thought he has wine, but turns out to be vinegar. That's why the punishment for arrogance is that your wine turns into vinegar. So this is such a powerful idea that you think you have wine, and it turns out you have vinegar. So to the arrogant man thinks he's something, he's really nothing. Obviously, we're worms, we're maggots. That's all we are. So Amar Amari Haimad the Yahir. So now Ramari says a person who is arrogant, afila inche bise makabel. Even inche bise is a reference to his wife. Even that his wife is not going to listen to him if he's arrogant. As it says, Gever Yahir v'lo yinveh. As it says in Habakkuk that he's the arrogant man. V'lo yinveh. What does it mean? My v'lo yinveh. What does that mean? It means b'naveh shelo. That even in his naveh, he will not be able be honored, even in his abode. Amar Yehuda Marav call miskaya betalis shel talmid chacham ve'eno talmid chacham machnisino so b'machitzo shel Kadosh Baruch Hu. Anyone who is arrogant or anybody who tries to exalt himself by wearing the garments of the Torah scholar, but he's not a Torah scholar, he has no business wearing them, then you don't let him go into the partition of God. So that's how we know that a person who's not a Torah scholar should not hold himself out to be acting like a Torah scholar. And so therefore, that's the basic idea. A person who's a Torah scholar should not be holding himself out like a Torah scholar. Because somebody who says, I'm a Torah scholar, when he's not, people are going to look at their actions and be disgusted. They say, this is Torah, and this will drive people away from Torah. That's why it's so dangerous. So a person gives his wine. So Rava's halacha is a person who gives his wine to the shopkeeper, and he says to the shopkeeper that basically, I want you to sell it little by little in the store. That's what he says to the shopkeeper. And so therefore, under those circumstances, basically the shopkeeper is acting like an agent. V'takif, and then the wine, and at that point, v'takif apalgo atilta, the wine becomes into vinegar after the shopkeeper sold a half or a third, he sold a certain amount. Then dinahu de mikabo lamine. Then the halacha is that the owner of the barrel basically accepted the loss upon himself. Rashbam says, Balabayas ko'av, said that the owner of the wine gets all the loss. Meaning to say, but we're talking about a case where the shopkeeper who took the wine in order to sell it for him, he was not negligent. So The little Amran, as the Gemara immediately qualifies, Ella the little Shani Barza. We only say this where he did not alter the spigot of Shani Barza lo, but if he altered the spigot, then it doesn't apply. Well, Amran Ella the Mata Yoma de Shuka. We only say this where he did not, where the day of the market, he didn't miss the market day of a Mata Yoma de Shuka. Well, but if the day of the market arose and the shopkeeper missed it, then the shopkeeper is responsible because he basically missed the time. So he was negligent at that point. And so therefore he's going to have to bear responsibility. So then the Gemara says, the Amarava, Rava says, Ayman de Kabil Chamrei Adai de Matilelo Parvasa Deval Shafat. So a person accepted upon himself basically to take the wine to this place that's called Parvasa Deval Shafat. So he accepted upon himself the wine, but this is like the case of an Iska, which we had already in Ezo Neshach, that we had these types of cases. And the case was that there's a investor and he gave the wine to this person to sell. And he says, I want you to sell it in this specific location. And then we're going to split the profits. And presumably also share in the losses. But by the time he got there, Zal, the price of wine in Parvasa Deval Shafat went down. Dinu de Mekabale. So the halacha is that the person who's the investor who gave him the wine, who gave him the money for the wine and said, you sell it there, he's the one who's going to have to absorb the loss because he said, I want you to sell it specifically in that place. The Dino the Makabel. Right. Rashbam explains the owner of the wine gets all the loss. The Kivin that feel him hokir miyad loyo rishuslam machro ad shemakil parvasim v'shafat because he had no permission to sell it elsewhere. So therefore, when it goes down, it's the owner of the wine's fault. It's his loss. But if it would be a different type of loss, like theft, or if it turned in vinegar, then they're going to split it because it's both of their bad luck. So then the Gemara asks the question, what we just spoke out, the Gemara asks, let's say that wine turned to vinegar. What's the law? It says the vinegar, it's a different story. Meaning to say, if it's in the vinegar, the owner of the wine does not have all the loss. And even though it's like he said, I'm buying it for cooking, meaning to say, and it needs to last. We still say at that point, both of their bad lucks caused it. With the look Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, and this is not like Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina. Remember what Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina? He said, Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina said that if it's in the domain, if it's in the barrels of the seller, then the seller is responsible. But we're not saying that. We're saying they're sharing the responsibility. But it's like Rabbi Bar Yosef who says, your mazel caused it. Since you both are involved with this, your mazel caused it. Come on, Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina. All right, so another is saying, no, even if it turned into vinegar, we're going to say that it's the person who owns the wine's responsibility, like Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, but if it's in the barrel of the seller is responsible because the wine was supposed to last, because he says, I want you to get to that place. Yasha Mishal Ashtaki, he says, I'm selling you the wine, it's from the previous year. And the wine is supposed to last until Sukkot. That was the 1 year from when they started selling it. Okay, so now we're up to the next mission. Mocher makom l'chavero, somebody who sells a piece of property to his friend, and he's selling it on the condition. He said, somebody's piece of property on the condition to build a house for my son after he got married, or for my daughter after if Rahman al-San she became a widow. Or if a person accepted a contract to build these types of houses for his friend. To build a house for the son-in-law or the son for his son. His son just got married, or a widow's house for his daughter. Bona arba amos al sheish. The assumption is such a house is going to be 4 by 6 amos. An am is 1.5 feet approximately. So it's going to be 6 feet by 9 feet. So the Gemara says that's the position of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Refet Bakar. This is a Refet Bakar. That's not a house. That's a barn. Remember when Rabbi Akiva got married to his wife Rachel? They were so poor that they lived in a barn. So Rabbi Akiva was able to live in this barn, but Rabbi Shmuel said, "No, you can't live like that." So that's a barn. We'll see what that means. And then the Mishnah says, if you want to build, if you contract to build a barn, you have to build 4 amos by 6 amos by a skatan, a small house, 6 ches, 6 amos by 8 amos, 6 ches. So it has to be 6 amos by 8 amos. Gadol, if he contracts to build a big house, then it has to be Shmona al Eser, 8 by 10, Chiraklin, which is a mansion, Yud al Yud, 10 by 10, and Rumo Kechatzi Arko. The height is like half the length. The Kechatzi Rachbot. So the height of these items that you contract to build, the height is, if you take half of the length and half of the width and you add them together, that is what the height has to be. Raya Davar. There's a proof for the matter. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer Kabinyan Ha'echel, like the building of the temple, like the base of Mikdash. We'll see how to read this Mishnah and the Gemara. So the Gemara says, first of all, Lamiste base chasnos lebeno ubase almanos ubito. Listen, base chasnos lebeno ubito ubase almanos lebeno ubito. Why does it have to say I'm building a house for my son after he got married, and a house for my daughter after she became Rahman al-Tzlan, a widow? Why didn't it just put them all together? Why specifically one for the son and one for the daughter in this type of lashon? So the Gemara explains, Milsa agav orche kamashon. The Gemara is the master teacher. The Gemara always teaches us things along the way. Agav orche. Along the way, the Gemara always teaches us other halachos. You're always able to pick up other halachos like in passing. And so here the Gemara is teaching us that the son is coming home to live in the father's house, and he shouldn't be living by his mother-in-law. And the Gemara cites here the book of Ben Sira several times in the Shas. The Gemara cites the Sefer Ben Sira. The Sefer Ben Sira is a book which contained wisdom, but it was not part of the canon. And so the Gemara cites it on occasion, rare occasions. I don't know, maybe you could look it up how many times, but if I had to guess, it would be certainly less than 10 times would be my guess. Maybe I remember offhand, maybe 3 other times. So we'll see. I'm curious that it is. I'll check. I'll Google it afterwards. How many times does the Gemara cite Ben Sira? So Kedosiv Sefer Ben Sira Kol Shakalti Bekaf Maznaim. Sefer Ben Sira says, I weighed everything in the scales. V'lo Matzati Kal Misubin. I didn't find anything more insignificant or less significant than bran. Bran is really, nobody wants the bran. Nowadays we do, but in those days nobody wanted it. The kal misubin, and worse than that is chasan adar beis lamav. Worse than that is a son-in-law living with his mother-in-law in the same apartment. In those days they all lived in one room, so it would be very inappropriate. The kal mechasan oreach machnes oreach, and worse than that is a guest who invites another guest. It's a chutzpah. You show up with your other guests and you mistreat the property. V'kal me'oreach meishiv davar b'terem yishma. And worse than this guest is the person who answers the question before he hears it. He gives an answer before he hears the question. Shenemar meishiv davar b'terem yishma ivelis. So as it states in the verse in Mishlei, if you meishiv davar b'terem yishma that this is a folly and a mistake to do such a thing, to answer a question before you heard it. It's a big mistake. Um, First, he'll make the mistake, and then uchima, and then he'll be embarrassed when he realizes he gave the wrong answer. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Shmuel says it's a ref at Bakar. And Rabbi Kiva said the house for your son is 4 amos by 6 amos. Rabbi Shmuel says that's a barn. It's not a house. So, and then the next Mishnah says if you want to make a ref at Bakar, it's 4 amos by 6 amos. So the Gemara asks the question. Who's the one who says that the barn is 4 amos by 6 amos? So Ikadama Rabbi Shmuel Katani La, Ikadama Rabbi Akiva Katani La. So some say that Rabbi Shmuel taught it, and some say Rabbi Akiva taught it. Ikadama Rabbi Akiva Katani La. Some say Rabbi Akiva taught it. Even though Rabbi Akiva says, even though it's a barn, sometimes a person will live like in a barn. That's Rabbi Akiva. He lived in a barn with his wife. And he used to pluck the straws out of each other's hair in the morning. Said the Gemara in the Dharm. Some say Rabbi Shmuel is the one who taught it. And he's explaining 4 by 6 is not a house, it's a barn. So it's if you want to make a barn, make it 4 amos by 6 amos. A traklin, this mansion, is yud al yud, is 10 amos by 10 amos. My traklin. What is this? What is this traklin? Kuvasa kufta bevardi. It's a giant room with windows, and you put there roses for decoration. Bekantir shtei masrei al shtei masrei, and a kantir is a mansion house. It's a cantor. Kantar is a giant mansion. This is a large courtyard that the officers build next to their palaces. And so it looks very nice to look at. It's a very large courtyard that they build there, and that size is 12 by 12. Rumo kachatzi, arko kachatzi rachbo. And we know that the height of this room has to be half its length plus half its width. Rayo Davar is a proof. Rashbag Omar Kabinyan Rashbag says a proof. It's like the building of the temple. Rayo Davar Mankatani. Well, who is the one who says this Rayo that this is proof? So Ikadama Rashbag Katani. Some say it's Rashbag. Valchakamer is what he said. Rayo Davar Minayan. How do we know a proof for this matter that this is what the building has to look like? So Amar Rashbag, I call Kabinyan that everything is like the temple. And so therefore, just like the temple is half the width and plus half the length, so that's the height. So too in this case. V'ika de Amar, and some say Tanakama Katanua, that's a Tanakama. V'Rashbag atmui kamatame. Rashbag was astonished by it. Rashbag was shocked. And this is what he says to the Tanakama. Raya minayan. What's your proof that the height is to be half the width plus half the length? You want to learn it out from the temple. Do you think every house is like the temple? We're not going to compare the houses to the temple. Tanya, meaning the temple is different. Tanya, Acherim Omrim, Rumo Kikorosav. A Brisa says that the Acherim say that the height is like the beams. So the Gemara says, V'lema Rumo Karachba. Why don't you just say the height is like the width? Why do you have to say the beams? Maybe the house, maybe what we're saying is that he doesn't say the height is like the width because the beams of the house are wider below and narrow on top, and so therefore it's going to be basically, if you're saying it's like the beams are going to be bigger if it's at the top, and so that's why it's saying it. Or alternatively, mishum deika beikave. Another reason why the beams are bigger because the house has space for to place the beams on it, so it's a little bit narrower than the actual beams. Okay, that's today's daf, but we'll just continue a few more minutes.